Welcome back guys, and it's time to talk about services. So far you've heard about scopes, models, controllers and views, but if you remember we mentioned in the controller lesson that services are used to deal with your application business logic. So if we keep going, what are services again? Services are the place where to put the application business logic, as we just said. You can share and reuse the code of your application thanks to services. The code is shared by using the Angular dependency injection system. Services are lazy loaded in the application, which means that they are instantiated whenever your application, specifically a component, requires it. So it's good for memory management, for example, because you won't have instances hanging around whenever they might not be necessary. And services are also singleton, and this means that there will always be one and one only instance of your service. So whenever you require to invoke a service function, the single object that is being created will be returned as a reference. Angular provides a set of built-in services. One of them is HTTP service that you see in the next lessons, because we'll be using that a lot. HTTP provides functions to perform HTTP calls, so get, puts and all the stuff. The log service is used for logging information to the browser console. There's also the timeout service, and this is another service that we'll be using in a few places. It's a wrapper for window.setTimeout, but you'll see more about its usage in the next section actually. The queue service is used to execute asynchronous functions. And then we have lots of other services like filter, locally, animate and much more. The true potential of services anyway comes when you want to create a custom service, which is exactly what we're going to do in a minute. And if you're writing a medium-large application, you'll probably need to implement your own services. What you do in order to implement it, as you can see from the example on the right, you just initialize the service on your module, and then the service in the example has one method only, which is getAnyName. And then the last thing is to inject the service into the controller and invoke the function. So as you can see on line 13, I have my controller, and in between square brackets I'm injecting the scope service as well as my trainee service that I've declared above. We have different ways in Angular that we can use to create our services. Angular calls them recipes. So basically they do pretty much the same thing, but there are small differences that we need to look at. So first of all, we can create a service as a service. So we use the service function, and we do app.service, our service name, our function with eventually an injection. And then we can reference our property, declare our property by using this dot some value equals some value. And then for function, we have this dot get some value and the function implementation. So this is because whenever we use .service, Angular creates the object with a new keyword whenever we inject it into our controllers. For this reason, we can access to all the properties and methods declared with this keyword. In another way, factory instead returns a reference to the service object that is being created, and so whatever we can access is just what's in the return function. So as you can see from the example, we declare a container for our factory. We declare all the function like some value that will return the property some value, and then we return it. So whatever is defined in this SRV is what will be returned. Everything that is outside that will not be accessible from our controller. Providers are the most verbose version of a service, and they can be configured in the Angular config phase, which is a part of the Angular bootstrap phase. We'll talk about Angular lifecycle later on. So for now, just ignore the provider's way of doing that, but be aware that in the Angular core code, a service is just a wrapper for factory, which is also a wrapper for providers. So at the very end, whatever is the way you'll be using, it will be a provider. Let's now try to put in practice what we just learned. We'll go back to our code and we'll convert our business logic in the controller to an actual service. So let's add a new factory in this case. So we'll do myapp.factory. The name will be maybe something like person service. Do we have to inject anything? I don't think so. So just an empty function, like here. And then we have to declare what we want to return. If you remember, a factory will return a reference to whatever is in the return function. So var, we'll call it like person equals double curly brackets. And here we'll define our person.printName method. Which is a function that takes two parameters, which are the first name and the last name. And we'll basically return first name, we have it here, first name, empty space, and last name. So far so good. And then in here we'll just do return person. Okay, so we have a function that takes as an input a first name and the last name and returns the concatenation of the two. Okay, now we just have to remove this colon here actually, guys, because it was a mistyping. We can modify our controller. So first of all, we have to inject our new service to his name. So we'll use comma person service. So we have injected the person service factory or service or provider as you wish into our controller. Now we can just modify the printName function, and instead of declaring a new function in the controller, we will just reference the one in our service. So we will be personService.printName, and we'll pass as parameters scope first name and last name. That's it. So let's have a look at what happens now. As you can see, nothing happens. There is an error because we have to modify our view as well. In here, we no longer call a function in our controller, we just pass the expression, the printName property, which is here, and we refresh. And again, the result will be the same. So we got rid actually of the function in our scope. So everything works fine. We're quite happy with what we did. We're actually no longer using a function inside our controller. But what happens if I change something in here? What do you think will happen? Will this string refresh because of the two-way data binding, or will it not? Let's see. So if I add an S, as you can see, nothing really changes because we are actually assigning a reference from our factory printName to this scope attribute. So basically this one is replacing our scope printName. So whenever there is a change to first name or last name, that change is not detected. And we'll talk more about the digest cycle in the upcoming lessons. So what we want to do now is just declare this still as a function, and what we'll do is it will return our personService.printName. We'll save it and we can try again, but this becomes a function once again in our view, right? So if we refresh now and we add something, it's working, because every time there is a change in first name, last name, the digest cycle will also refresh the value in printName, and every time it will call return personService.printName. I know it might sound confusing, but anyway, be aware that we have moved our logic into the service, we could do the same for first name and last name. We might create some methods, functions like get first name and get last name, and we'll no longer have any business logic in our controller. Our controller will just use the service to retrieve the data and eventually assign that to the scope variable, so that the view will be able to see it. So I hope that this lesson was pretty clear to you guys. I know there's a lot into that. I suggest you take the code attached to the lesson. I've attached both the initial version and the final version of the code we've been using during this specific section. But I would like you guys to try replicating what I did. Maybe experiment with that. Try to use a service instead of factory. Maybe don't use provider yet, because we'll be using that in our actual application. So if you have any questions, please leave those in the comments or get in touch with myself, and I'll be glad to help you guys out.